Greetings from London. Welcome to Chatham House for this webinar on how international organisations fight for legitimacy. Chatham House has been convening on topical issues of international affairs for over 100 years. Today, we will be discussing why the issue of legitimacy is important for international organisations. Today, we are on the record, live and being recorded. I'm Rashmin Sagoo, Director of the International Law Programme here at Chatham House. You'll be relieved to know we aren't discussing the legal niceties of issues concerning international organisations today. Instead, we have a stellar lineup of experts to take us through the specific issue of legitimacy. Introducing our speakers today. Firstly, we've got our discussant, Professor Tobias Lenz from Leuphana University of Lüneburg in Germany, and our very distinguished panel includes Professor Sarah von Billebeck, Professor of International Relations at the University of Reading, Professor Laura Ann Viola, Professor of Political Science at the Freie Universität zu Berlin, and Joel Ng, Research Fellow and Deputy Head, Center for Multilateral Studies at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Welcome to all our speakers and welcome to our audience also. We're going to be hearing from our speakers in the first half of the session, and then there will be time for Q&A at the end. So please do submit your questions in the Q&A function, and we will moderate those and have a discussion at the end. Tobias, if I may start with you, I'm aware that you've done this stellar job of editing a new special edition of International Affairs on this issue. But before we dive into the detail and the substance, could you perhaps just give us a bit of could we zoom out and could you give us a big picture perspective of what we mean by legitimacy, why it's important at the moment, just to get us all on the same page before we kick off?
Sure, very much so. Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me, for being able to reach out to all of you. The liberal international order, so they say, is currently under pressure, both from within and without. From within, we see the increasing rise of right-wing populism in many Western countries, and from without, we see increasing number of states that contest central tenets of the liberal international order. And with that order being under pressure, we see one of its core pillars to be increasingly contested and critiqued. That is international governmental organizations. Many of you work for international organizations, so you know about this from the inside. The United Nations, for example, struggles to really be active in avoiding the Russian aggression or invasion of Ukraine. The WHO struggled to really be a core player during the COVID pandemic and so on. And what we study in this special issue, the contributors to this special section of international affairs, is to look at how international organizations react to and react to that increasing contestation of world politics. We frame the special section as being about strategies of legitimation, by which we mean international organizations' active attempts to defend and to boost their own legitimacy. Legitimacy is the perception among audiences that the organization is normatively appropriate. That means that its procedures, purposes, and/or performance align with the normative values of that audience. So one can think of legitimacy as a normative evaluation that stakeholders of an international organization undertake. And it's important for any political organization, really, but for international organizations in particular. Ever since Max Weber, a famous German sociologist in the early 20th century, legitimacy is seen as an important governance resource that helps authorities to stabilize their rule, to rule more cheaply, and to enhance the compliance with the rules that they espouse. Now, international organizations rely on legitimacy even more so in many ways because they lack the coercive enforcement mechanisms that many, say, national political organizations have at their disposal. They rely entirely on voluntary compliance. And the second reason is that many international organizations nowadays operate in an increasingly dense institutional field. So they compete with other international organizations that solve similar problems for similar member states. And in such a situation of competition and rivalry, let's say, it's important for international organizations to be legitimate in order to stand their ground, as it were, to remain in an important focal area for solving certain transnational problems. So given the importance of legitimacy for international organizations, it's not surprising that these organizations try to actively promote their own legitimacy. Okay, and what we study in this special section is to ask, how specifically do organizations do that? And why are there differences in the ways in which they do so? These are the two kind of guiding questions, so to speak. And I'm going to say a little bit now about kind of two core themes or two main answers, say, to these research questions before I pass on to my fellow contributors. So how do international organizations fight for legitimacy? What are their legitimation strategies? And one of the core findings here is that really all the organizations we study invest considerable time and resources into actively promoting the organization's legitimacy. So they actively engage in legitimation. It is a pervasive activity of diverse international organizations. And in the special section, we don't just focus on, say, some of the bigger and more well-known organizations, which we'll hear about a little bit today, say the WTO or the United Nations, but we also study, say, regional organizations in the Global South. And on that point, we do contest kind of a core aspect of the literature on international organization legitimacy, which is the idea that legitimation is directly related to the authority that an international organization exerts. Think of authority as the independence that an IO has from member states. And the idea is that especially those that are very authoritative, very strong organizations such as the EU, say, or the United Nations Security Council, these are the organizations that legitimize, whereas those other organizations that are very much products of their member states, they don't really need legitimation, need to engage in legitimation as much. And we show that all organizations, or for all organizations, this is a core activity. Okay, and then briefly on the second question, so how do they do so? This is, or why is there variation, across IOs? This is partially a question about what are the sources of legitimation strategies. And here we find that these sources are diverse. Much of the literature that exists on the topic thinks of legitimation as being a reflection of what core stakeholders of the organizations want to hear, okay? That audiences are the main drivers of these legitimation strategies. And we show that that is indeed an important source, but there's at least two other sources that is relevant. And I think the contributors will also speak to this. One other source is the agents themselves, that is the representatives of these organizations and their own normative beliefs. They express those through legitimation strategies. And the other source is an international organization's environment. That is the idea that IOs are partially isomorphic creations that adopt and then also espouse what other organizations around them do. Think of the discourse on democracy and human rights in the 1990s as a dominant discourse that many organizations then adopted, even if they weren't just composed of democracies as member states themselves. Okay, so we find that a range of different sources is relevant to understanding how organizations legitimize. And I would pass on now to my co-contributors.
Thanks so much, Tobias. That's such a fantastic overview. Laura, if I may turn to you, I know your interest from recollection is really on how informal groups within international organizations seek and become a source of legitimacy. But please, over to you.
Yes, hi, thanks for this invitation, and hello to everyone out there joining us. So I thought I'd begin, and I hope you'll forgive me for this, by reminding us of the COVID pandemic. It seems so long ago. But about this time of year in 2021, during the COVID crisis, and even the height of the COVID crisis, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, gave a press conference in which he said that the world is now in vaccine apartheid, characterized by scandalous inequity of vaccine availability, especially between wealthy developed states and low-income underdeveloped states. And since the beginning of the pandemic, developing countries have been pointing to their difficulties accessing vaccines, and they've actively tried to use international organizations like the World Health Organization and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to address the inequality. So specifically, back in October 2020, a coalition of developing countries at the World Trade Organization proposed a temporary waiver of the WTO's Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights, also known as the TRIPS rules, in order to supply affordable generic vaccines to low-income countries. But the waiver was blocked by wealthy developed countries, in particular the US, Canada, and EU countries. Now, this issue was taken up, as many of you know, again, most recently at the last World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference last June. And it did finally deliver a TRIPS waiver intended to expand access to COVID vaccines. Now, the measure has been criticized, first of all, for coming too late. I mean, essentially, it was at the end of the pandemic emergency, for doing too little, and really for being the result of an undemocratic process. And the reason I start with this episode is because I think, first of all, it addresses a pressing policy issue, but also I think it tells us something about the legitimacy crisis of international organizations, or IOs, that Tobias introduced. And there are two things that I want to draw your attention to here. First, the initial refusal of developed countries to entertain a vaccine waiver was accompanied by an explicit debate about the legitimacy of the decision-making process at the WTO. And the critique is that large-scale IOs, like the World Trade Organization, are facing a legitimacy crisis in part, not only, but in part because their decision-making does not reflect the political or demographic balance of the world. Second, the TRIPS vaccine waiver proposal, the one that was proposed by developing countries, was not only submitted by individual developing countries, but also co-sponsored by informal groups of developing countries, in this case, the African group and the least developed country, or LDC group. And this raised a second point of contention. So while we talk about the legitimacy of the WTO quite a lot, what is the legitimacy of these informal groups acting within formal organizations? They have no legal status or formal authority, and yet they appear to be active governance agents. So my contribution to the special issue is to think about the legitimacy requirements, also legitimation strategies, not only of formal organizations such as the WTO that have a lot of authority, but especially of these informal groups. In my case, in particular, informal groups at the WTO. And as it turns out, there are dozens of informal groups active within and across international organizations. I already mentioned the African group, the LDC group, but there's also the Cotton 4, the Small and Vulnerable Economies group, the G20 Agriculture group, and many others. And maybe I should say here, by informal groups, I'm speaking specifically about institutions that are composed of states who agree to coordinate common policy positions. They aspire to speak and negotiate on behalf of their constituent members, but they have no formal delegation of authority. They're non-binding. As I said, they have no legal status. In other words, they have very low authority. So thinking about the legitimacy of the WTO and of informal groupings of states within the WTO suggests, I think, a bigger question, which I formulate like this. Who engages in legitimation strategies in global governance? Why do they do so? And how do they? And the most prominent argument in the literature at the moment links legitimacy needs directly and tightly to authority, arguing that legitimacy only becomes an issue once an institution possesses authority. And in the absence of authority, there is no legitimacy problem. And there's a very important argument at the moment that some of the cause of the crisis of liberal international order is the increasing authority of these formal organizations. So here, who engages in legitimation strategies, according to this argument at least, is clearly highly authoritative IOs. And this seems to show, seems to fit, as I show in my contribution, this seems to fit with the case of the WTO. So the WTO, as it's gained authority over the years without becoming more inclusive of marginalized actors, has suffered a legitimacy crisis, and it has tried to counter that crisis by engaging heavily in legitimation strategies. But then, what can this approach tell us about the legitimacy of these informal groups that seem also to be active, that have low authority? So I would argue that even if increasing authority does lead to increased demands for legitimacy and is an important part of the story overall, it doesn't necessarily mean that low authority institutions, such as these informal groups that I look at, have low legitimacy requirements. So in my contribution, I developed an alternative argument that I call the two-sided legitimacy hypothesis. And in that argument, I contend that institutions with either very low or very high authority are likely to face especially strong incentives to seek legitimacy, but for different reasons. So in contrast to the standard argument, which is sort of a linear relationship between authority and legitimacy or legitimation needs, I see what you might visualize as a U-shaped curve, where especially high and low legitimacy organizations strive for authority through, strive for legitimation and engage in certain tactics to do that. And one of the important parts of my argument is to say that they do so high and low authority institutions do so for different reasons. For high authority institutions like the WTO, legitimacy is complementary to authority. It buttresses it, it improves or makes more efficient member state support and compliance with rules and regulations. And as authority increases without an increase in legitimacy, there will be a problem soliciting that compliance and support. And that's the problem for high authority institutions. Institutions with low authority, like the LDC group or the African group or the G20 agricultural group, in contrast, seek legitimacy to substitute for what they don't have in authority, for their lack of authority, or even to help achieve authority. So legitimacy can substitute for authority by generating voluntary commitment on the part of constituents to follow an informal group, even if they don't have any legal authority or any formal binding authority. And greater legitimacy may even bring constituents to grant authority, even formalized authority, to these informal groups. So indeed, in my study, I find that low authority informal groups of the WTO engage extensively in discursive and institutional legitimation strategies. And in fact, one of the primary things that they do in their communiques and their press statements is to justify their legitimacy to potential constituents, and also vis-a-vis developed countries and the WTO itself, that often call their legitimacy to speak on behalf of developing countries into question. And finally, I would point to another sort of interesting twist in this argument. Because informal groups can enhance the voice and participation of developing countries within formal organizations like the WTO itself can draw on informal groups, for example, by giving them financial or technical support as a source of legitimacy for the WTO itself. So to try to gain the legitimacy of, for example, developing country members, the WTO as a formal organization can try to harness these informal groups to itself. So those are some of the interesting dynamics I pick up on by trying to leverage the different kind of authorities that we have in international institutions.
Laura, thank you so much for that. I've actually already got lots of questions bubbling up in my mind. In case any of our audience has also, just a reminder to please feel free to start putting questions in the Q&A function. But now we turn to Sarah von Billebeck, who's going to tell us a little bit about international organizations like the UN and how they maintain legitimacy internally, including with their staff. Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. So my contribution to the special issue and my remarks today turn the lens inward on this question of legitimacy in international organizations, in that I focus on what I call self-legitimation in IOs. So these are internal legitimation efforts, and I look at why these succeed or fail and why this matters at all. So I'll start by just saying, what is self-legitimation? Well, as you've probably seen from the discussion thus far today, most discussions of IO legitimacy focus on external audiences. So member states, domestic publics, beneficiaries, the press, but this leaves out the staff of the IO itself. However, the belief in the legitimacy of the organization, its work, its objectives, and so on, is as important for staff as it is for those external audiences. And without this belief, staff become demotivated, uncommitted, and ultimately really ineffective. And I wager that this is particularly true for large IOs like the UN and NATO and the World Bank, which is what my research has been based upon. these organizations tend to have very complex organizational identities, wide-ranging, sometimes even contradictory mandates, and convoluted structures that include political leadership, member states, and staff. And in that kind of an environment, staff often have to make very difficult choices about what to do, and sometimes they have to behave in ways that violate their own norms and standards. And where this is the case, they turn to self-legitimation to sort of reiterate and reinforce a sense of cohesion, of appropriateness, and of purpose. The majority of this kind of self-legitimation takes place through narratives, stories, and language that are used within the organization. And these narratives are usually proposed by the senior leadership of the IO, and they're directed towards staff, who are the audience. However, what we don't know very much about is why some narratives in organizations succeed and become dominant. Other narratives are sort of just ignored and simply peter out, and others are challenged by counter narratives put forward by staff. Now, of course, the success or failure of a narrative is going to depend on a lot of factors, but in my research, I've focused on content and the ways in which the content of those narratives matters. So I identify three main categories of content. The first of these is purpose. So these are narratives that focus on the IO's mission and values at the very broadest level and the degree to which the IO remains aligned with those values. The second category is performance. These are narratives that focus on the achievement of stated goals, operational successes, and the impact of the IO's work. And finally, politics. These are narratives that highlight the degree to which the IO uses and emphasizes and appreciates the independent expertise of its staff, as compared to how much it caters to the specific political interests of member states or of the IO's politically appointed leadership. Now, I find that narratives of purpose stick the most. They tend to be the ones that succeed and become dominant. And where narratives focus on performance or politics too much, they're more susceptible to challenge. And importantly, where that happens, the IO leadership that puts forward these narratives may be compelled to change them in line with staff demands. Narratives of purpose are more likely to become dominant for three reasons. The first of these is that IO sort of missions and values at that broadest level tend to be moralistic and very hard to refute. So things like making peace, feeding the hungry, combating poverty, it's hard to be against these kinds of things, right? These are also perceived to be universal and shared by people everywhere. And finally, they gloss over the day-to-day difficulties and challenges of IO work. And so they ignore the complexity and fragmentation that I described earlier, and therefore enable a sense of cohesion and purpose. By contrast, narratives of performance or politics are less convincing to staff. So in terms of performance, the work that IOs do is very complex and it's very hard, and therefore it's difficult to definitively demonstrate success. And in addition, exactly what success is or looks like is often contested. And in terms of politics, narratives that focus on politics tend to highlight the fact that staff do sometimes have to comply with the narrow political interests of member states or of the IO leadership, even if it sort of goes against their own expertise and their self-images as people doing good in the world. And so even if they understand those obligations, they find those narratives less convincing. So that sort of takes me to the kind of so what question. Does any of this matter? Now, obviously in the paper, I illustrate this with a couple of case studies. In the interest of time, I won't do that here, but in terms of whether it matters, my answer is perhaps predictably yes. First of all, self-legitimation is pervasive. As Tobias said before, legitimation in IOs is pervasive. It's a commonplace activity and it's quite time-consuming. Staff at all levels in an organization are doing this. So our understanding of IO legitimacy is incomplete if we ignore the internal dimension of legitimation efforts. Second of all, a coherent sense of organizational identity and a sense of rightfulness is key to staff motivation and commitment in IOs. And I think neglecting this has real impacts on IO effectiveness. Most staff in IOs don't work there by accident. They work there because they believe in the work. It's not just, some job that they've gotten. So as a result, where IO leadership gets self-legitimation right, they will enjoy the sort of immense benefit of a more motivated and dedicated workforce, which is no small thing in light of the very complex work that they do. And the same is true for member states who often push for reforms or conduct reviews that sort of inevitably focus on cutting costs and value for money and increasing productivity. And while IO staff, of course, appreciate the importance of those things, those kinds of initiatives leave out this sort of key moral dimension of their work, that, as mentioned, is very crucial to their self-images and to their motivation and ultimately their effectiveness. And just to end by linking this back to what Tobias said at the very start, I think this is especially important in the context of the contestation of the liberal order, increased skepticism of multilateralism, increased geopolitical tensions. These are playing out in IO forums like the UN Security Council and so on. So staff motivation is already being sort of dampened by that. And if it's also internally not being boosted, I think we could see some real problems for IOs. So I will leave it there and thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Sarah, thank you so much. I'm going to in a moment just give Tobias a couple of minutes just to reflect in cases that, I'm going to hand over to Joel and then give Tobias a couple of minutes to reflect in case he wants to weave in any further comments before we go to Q&A. But, you know, really so much of what you said really chimes with me. I have background, diplomatic experience in both a member state and in different international organizations. And that question of how to attract and retain the best talent in what is effectively an international civil service, really, to achieve the international organization's mission is so critical at the moment in time that we find ourselves. So thank you. Joel, over to you, please. Your reflections from an Asia-Pacific perspective in particular, and I understand your work is really looking at the relative power, how relative power impacts how actors maintain their legitimacy. Please, welcome.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. We just had the ShangriLa Dialogue in Singapore over the weekend, and it's the premier security summit of our region. Pretty adversarial. If you've seen some of the news headlines about China and the US crossing swords at this dialogue, well, that's exactly what's the subject of my paper. The US and China have been in contest with each other for primacy in the security architecture of the Asia-Pacific, or as the US now calls it, the Indo-Pacific. And these legitimation strategies are on, prime display, especially at things like the ShangriLa Dialogue. The one that has just passed, both the US and China accused each other of bullying. Both of them claimed that they would be the actor that would protect smaller states from the other, but their messages are essentially different based on what they think the other one is doing wrong, right? So the US is accusing China of disrupting the rules-based order, which in China's view is a byword for liberal international order, which they do intend to disrupt, but not the rules-based order. And then for China, they accused the US of setting up an Indo-Pacific NATO, or having a Cold War mentality and trying to raise tensions in the region. Right. So in this very heady superpower clash, we have the small states, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, who are caught between them. None of them have the power to really significantly influence the US or China, but they do have to make their voice heard. And the common mantra within Southeast Asia is that they don't want to choose sides and that their region is an open and inclusive one, that they need both actors to be engaged, but also committed to peaceful resolution of disputes and diplomacy and so on. So those very contrasting messages I found to be really useful to look at through Tobias and Fred Soderbaum's AAE framework, the agents, audiences, and environment as sources of legitimation, right? And I decided in my paper to test 3 hypotheses that established powers, the ones that have set up the order that currently exists, are more likely to use agent-based strategies because, well, they created those rules in the first place. So when they appeal to the rules, they're actually appealing to their own preferences. And the rising powers who are unhappy with those rules, and in my paper, of course, China is the prime example of that, they're more likely to try to use audience-based strategies. There are other states that are also unhappy with the rules to different degrees, and they want to appeal to them particularly to generate some sort of momentum for change. And then weak powers, I felt, were more likely to use those environmental-based strategies where they draw from the rules, norms, principles, and ideas outside of, in the general environment, and find the ones that are more likely to be useful for their particular interests and try to amplify those or support those norms especially. And in my paper on security architecture particularly, I looked at the way in which the region itself was defined, whether it's Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific or something else. How did each state try to push their version, right? So the US introduced Indo-Pacific, or well, forcefully reintroduced Indo-Pacific in 2017 after some failed attempts by other states to use that as the demarcation. And they were successful this time. The second thing was about the structure of the relationships between participants of the region, right? Do we go for a very broad multilateral setup like as has been set up by ASEAN, or do we think of bilateral alliances in which case the superpowers have quite significant advantages in terms of their power asymmetry, or do we look at sort of mini-laterals, the smaller purpose specific vehicles for tackling particular challenges? And we see all of these also now in contest with each other, or to some degree being used by different ones, and each of the actors having their own particular preferences on that. And then finally, I looked at the rules-based order. It's a term that you would think isn't very controversial, but in fact has been deeply, deeply contested in our region because, as I said, China views that as a byword for liberal international order, and which they do not like. The US has been trying very hard to dissociate it from a liberal order, but nobody seems to believe them. And then ASEAN has its own version, which is called a rules-based community, which is rather like the rules-based order, but a bit more informal. And so all of these actors, when analyzed against their power relation, I did find a fairly strong correlation between established powers appealing to their own internal preferences. The US cannot resist talking about democracy, human rights, and so forth. That is shared by some member states, some states in the region, but not all, certainly not China. China varied. It's sometimes used, or mostly used audience-based strategies when in a global or broader regional context where it was in the same room with the US. But when it was in a room where it only had the ASEAN member states, all of whom were smaller than itself, it actually reverted to agent-based strategies. It didn't really need to appeal to the audience anymore because the power asymmetry was so strong. And then, of course, ASEAN, it's maybe predictably was always appealing to the other two to try to reconcile different views or norms that they were proposing. And I felt it was fairly strong use of environmental strategies. So that's the teaser about what my paper is about, and I hope look forward to this discussion.
Joel, thank you so much. It's a really fascinating canter through your paper. And for anyone interested on the points that you've picked up on concerning the rules-based order and human rights and the power rivalry in that that you highlighted, Chatham House recently produced a paper, Human Rights Diplomacy, Navigating an Era of Polarization, which we can add into the link, but it also touches on the points you raised about, you know, how do other countries or regions have a voice within that? So that might be of interest. Tobias, would you like to reflect on anything that's been said so far, or do you have any questions you wanted to ask our esteemed panel?
I see that many people from the audience are jumping in and asking loads of questions, so I think we should use the remaining time to just talk with the audience rather than amongst ourselves.
That's absolutely fine. For some reason, I'm having some issues with my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to pick some, and Tobias, if there's anything that speaks to you that you'd like us to also talk to, please let me know. So we've got a question about how what I'll do is maybe I'll take 2 or 3, and then I'll let our panel pick which ones speak to them. So how might the WTO regain its legitimacy while it tolerates its rules and procedures being overridden or bypassed? And then there's questions about IO's struggle with colonial legacies and trust. So we've spoken about, some of the speakers spoke about trust, going through different, in very different perspectives. I know it's, again, something that's come up in, I imagine in Joel's work, some more about, and then a question about concerns about growing Chinese influence in the WHO. Or is it merely American alarmism at the reigning control over the international order? Joel, some of that seems on your patch, but if others wanted to dive in, please do, while I look at the other questions.
Okay, so the colonial legacies or Western dominated approaches, on the one hand, are actually, at least in the Asia Pacific, are responsible for that sort of dynamic growth we've had for the last 40 years or more. And so to that extent, everyone has benefited to some degree from the liberal international order. And we were expecting perhaps that maybe optimistically that China would see the benefits and therefore more likely to adjust towards that order. And it didn't really do that. And instead, it's trying to now create its own structure or structures, which are more in line with its view of where it should rightfully sit in the international order, as one of the global superpowers. And this has caused a lot of friction in a lot of international organizations, not just the ones I study, but I think the UN, WHO, and all that, which have been alluded to in the questions. And what they're doing is they're packing their staff. Chinese nationals are applying for these jobs and actually starting to dominate some of the bureaucracies of these international organizations. So that actually is perhaps something Sarah it might have something to say about, but there are different ways in which they can actually attack or challenge the status quo. And China is using a rather indirect one, I think. Not necessarily on the legitimacy front. I think, at least in my paper, I say that their audience-based strategy struggles to find a real coherent theme to itself because the audiences are too diverse. You can't appeal to something that everyone agrees with, although you can appeal to something that everyone dislikes, right? So it's a negative message rather than a positive one, and it's really hard to come up with a coherent message. In place of that, I think, some of China's actions are therefore to go into the organizational structures and try to work from within. And that's much harder to observe and much harder to also challenge.
Thank you, Joel. Anyone else? Laura?
Yeah, a fefew questions are about the WTO, and maybe also I'll try to address Charlie's concern about the WHO. So to Tala and Andrew's question. So first of all, I think that colonial legacies are very apparent in international organizations, and we have to take those seriously when we talk about also the inequalities that plague them. And I think you see that quite clearly also in the vaccine distribution discussion. The question is, what can be done about it? And I think this goes also to Andrew's question about how to regain legitimacy. And I think for that, we can look at the scholarship on legitimacy and legitimation to first understand what are the sources of legitimacy. So if you want to regain legitimacy, we'd have to know sort of what are the sources of legitimacy. And at least two important inputs for legitimacy are the procedural rules by which decisions are made within an organization, and also the kind of performance or output that organizations engage in. And I think on both counts, the WTO is suffering, right? So on the one hand, the procedural fairness is called into question, especially by developing countries. On the other hand, the output or performance is called into question by countries like the United States, established powers who are unhappy. And I suggest that on the one hand, informal groups are one way to leverage to increase the leverage of developing countries in the absence of formal rules that could improve procedural fairness. So I don't think that informal groups are a panacea. I think that formal changes would help improve the equity of decision-making, the fairness of decision-making in a way that informal groups can't, but informal groups could be one path. We have it's very difficult to get formal change in formal international organizations. So informal groups may be one way to increase the leverage, for example, of developing countries, if we can get developing countries to work together. Some developing countries are looking for formal recognition of their groups, like the Small and Vulnerable Economies grouping, but the WTO has rejected it because the developed world doesn't want to recognize them as having any formal standing. So that's on the, I think on the procedural fairness side, there may be some informal paths that could be taken in the absence of formal rule change. On the performance and the output, I think that one of the approaches that's being taken right now at the WTO is to try to, since there's deadlock and inability to move forward within the larger membership, there has been an initiative to try to work within plurilateral and minilateral formats in parallel to the WTO. These are called the joint statement initiatives. And rather than being seen as competitors directly to the WTO, those initiators of these joint statement initiatives are looking for sort of like-minded actors. And then they claim their aim is to create an agreement amongst like-minded actors to move forward and increase the output on certain issues, and then to reintegrate those into the WTO. Now, many countries are skeptical of this, including India and Brazil, because they worry that this approach might increase the effectiveness of the WTO, but undermine the multilateral process and therefore also the inclusion of all of the membership. So I think there are real trade-offs here that we need to think about. And just maybe finally on the WHO and Charlie's question, I think that sort of both things are true, that the United States and especially under Trump has sort of overhyped the rivalry with China for various also domestic political reasons, and that this is actually quite dangerous. But on the other hand, we also know from previous pandemics, including the Ebola virus and H1N1, that the WHO has a history of being too deferent to the self-reporting of member states, because the WHO structure is such that it's completely dependent, almost completely dependent on the donations of the donors, not only member states, but also other actors like the Gates Foundation. And so, unfortunately, the WHO has not been able to show a lot of independence vis-a-vis these groups. During the Ebola crisis, for example, Doctors Without Borders was very clear in reporting on the extent of the spread of the disease, whereas countries that were affected were underreporting, and the WHO chose to use information coming from countries in order not to upset also their very vested interests in not over-reporting the disease. And it turned out that was the wrong decision. They didn't make decisions based on science. And I think we could see something similar happening during the COVID crisis, deference to Chinese reporting on the spread of the virus and not really having enough independence from member states to make its own judgments as strongly as it could have. So I think, in that way, both points have a lot of validity.
Thank you, Laura. Anybody else on those questions before I turn to others? Tobias.
Let me maybe jump in on the colonial legacies question, which I think is a very important one. I take the point that colonial legacies are relevant to understanding the legitimacy of today's IOs, but I do wonder whether, say, what one might call double standards is not what is driving much of that dissatisfaction by many states in the global south with the way that international organizations work. Right? Colonial legacies would suggest that former colonial powers are those that find it particularly difficult to be seen as legitimate. But I think the United States, for example, as the global hegemon, arguably, that it still is often also seen as overly dominant in many international organizations, right? And that's not an issue of colonialism, arguably. The US was never a big colonial power. I think there is an issue of double standards here. That is, the West likes to take the moral high ground on certain issues, call them liberal values, right? Democracy, human rights, rule of law, etc. But then it doesn't always act according to them or in line with them. And I think that's what's causing a lot of the resentment against organizations that are seen as being dominated by Western states. It's maybe not so much the colonial legacy itself, but it's really the way in which former colonial powers, as well as others, nowadays act within these organizations and that's not always aligned well with what they say that these organizations should do, right? And I do want to add one point on Laura when it comes to the question of, WTO and other organizations, how can they improve their legitimacy? Procedural rules are important, performance is important, and so is the purpose. And Sarah mentioned that many international organizations pursue purposes that are difficult to contest, and so they do, but I think the WTO might be one where the purpose itself has become quite contested, right? If you think of the WTO as being created to liberalize trade, some would say liberalize trade at all costs. I think then trade liberalization itself has become a purpose that many states, including many Western states, in fact, have become much more critical of. And in times of climate change and so on, everyone is aware that we need to balance the objective of trade liberalization, which might be to the benefit of all, against other important issues such as climate change, right? And that there might be important trade-offs, as Laura mentioned. And so I think for some international organizations, contestation in part comes from the perception of what the objectives are that these organizations pursue, not only the procedural rules as well as the ways in which they perform.
Thanks, Tobias. Sarah, if I may bring you into this discussion also, both on the question of colonialism, because obviously staff members are also affected, like within international organization structures, and as you mentioned, they have, they're also looking at the internal dialogue about what their purpose is and what their role is in the wider organization and its mandate. And perhaps you could pick up on one of the questions, if I may pose to you. I think it was from a colleague who's not put their name there, but it's about new organizations that might be thinking about these questions of international organizations that are perhaps being established, but from a perspective of legitimacy, what should they keep in mind? What are the really practical issues that they should be keeping at the forefront of their mind? With a slight caveat that obviously there's lots of very strict rules about the establishment of international organizations in the first place.
Yeah,
please.
Yeah, so just on this question of colonialism, and I can link it back to another question that also appeared in the chat. I mean, one of the risks of self-legitimation, the way I talk about it, is that it can really obscure any recognition of inequalities and things like colonial legacies. And it can obscure difficult discussions about difficult questions like Natasha raised in her query in the Q&A. I mean, if you tell yourself all the time that you're doing good, you reduce the need to self-scrutinize, to really look into the weeds and see as an organization what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and what you're sort of pulling the wool over your own eyes, if you like, and you absolve yourself of the need to take drastic measures to change how you operate. And we see this very frequently when there are proposed changes within big IOs. There usually tends to be quite a lot of resistance from staff, and I think this probably extends beyond IOs, but my research has been on IOs, so I'll stick with that. I mean, self-legitimation narratives are really internal, and so they tend to remain at this very broad level. So they gloss over the controversy, they gloss over the difficult stuff. They also tend to be told and retold, and this really entrenches them as sources of legitimacy. And importantly, what matters here isn't so much whether they're accurate necessarily, but whether they're believable, whether they're convincing, and whether they reinforce this kind of positive and normatively good identity that staff in IOs want to have. They want to believe that they're doing good in the world. So this gets complicated where there are things like colonial legacies, and it gets particularly complicated where internal narratives are heard externally, or where there are external imperatives that are sort of nudging into that kind of internal space of discussion and storytelling. And I think that's actually something I'd like to do more research on is how successful can IO staff be in sort of ignoring questions surrounding things like colonial legacies, racialization within organizations, for example, inequalities within the way they treat staff, and all kinds of things that happen within organizations that they're able to simply ignore because of the narratives that they tell themselves that are so good. All of that being said, I think while self-legitimation efforts and this kind of need to communicate internally with your staff has risks, of course, overall, if I were as you said, setting up a new international organization, it's something I would actually take very seriously. Most IOs have an external communications or a public relations department, and they throw a lot of resources at that. Very few of them have even close to the same amount of resources for internal efforts. And I think the risks there are that you get staff that are cynical, they don't understand what it is they're supposed to do, what is the identity of the organization. So I would actually say one very practical thing is to put resource into communicating with staff. Staff want to be treated as international civil servants, as independent experts. They consider themselves a sort of elite in that they are self-selected into an organization that does this big, good global work. And I think it's important to speak to that identity for them, to reinforce that identity for them, and to allow them to express themselves as independent experts, and not simply as agents of member states, if you like. So those are a couple of the sort of, I mean, I could go into much more detail, but I'm not the only one who wants to speak and ask questions. But I think those are some of the few practical things I would really emphasize is put resource into communicating with your staff regularly about what is the point of everything that we do.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And that really also it shows that there's actually there's such a need for humility and vulnerability actually also in that communication to staff, and that willingness to open up a space for constructive challenge and feedback, which is often very difficult in complex international organizations. But point well made, thank you. But yes, very mindful that there's so many people doing great work, but that halo effect can sometimes blind us to what's really happening and how to uncover and unpack what staff are really thinking about and need to address. So thank you. Joel, if I may turn to you, there's a couple of questions I've seen popping up. I don't know if there's one on China's influence more generally in terms of its influence within international organizations, but also how you have the open dialogue with China inside an international organization. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that one particularly, or if there might be others you may wish to speak to.
Okay. Well, to Tom's question, I have to disagree that China is a malign influence in international organizations. That's certainly there are certainly negative effects sometimes, but not always, and certainly not universal. And I don't even think generally a negative influence. That said, China has a number of contradictory stances. This is unrelated, but I was recently asked to write a paper on UN Security Council reform. And the interesting thing is that everyone understands that representation is important for legitimacy. So the UN Security Council needs to be expanded because it's very unreflective of global distribution of power. And China has been knocking on the door and saying of other international organizations and saying we're underrepresented. But at the one seat where they have representation, they're actually one of the major blockers of UN Security Council reform. So in fact, the US, which you might think would, given their past experience with blocking reform at the IMF or World Bank, you'd think that more likely to block this, but they're actually open to suggestions on expanding membership in the Security Council. So China has to be a bit more consistent, basically. If it wants to be a global security actor, which it clearly does, Xi Jinping has announced his Global Security Initiative, then it needs to think about how it's going to enact a structure or regional structure that is not as hierarchical as the one it uses domestically. That means it's not as authoritarian and top-down. And it does not yet have, I don't think, an answer to that. So that is where we see a lot of contradiction between the way they approach IOs, and I think it generally comes a lot from their own domestic experience. Like, this is how we manage governance in general. That's what we learned from our domestic experience. But it doesn't mesh well with a global arena where we've enjoyed a putative equality of states for the last 50, 60 years. So this is the difficulty with China, and I don't think it's, but I do disagree that it's always a malign influence. It's just a much more complex affair than that.
Thank you, Joel. Tobias, did you want to come in on as just as a general discussant? Or did you have general thoughts on any of the other questions before we wrap up? Because I'm really conscious of time.
Well, there's plenty of interesting questions, and a lot could be said about all of these issues. Maybe I pick up on two. I saw one interesting question by Madalena on partnership with other legitimate entities. So indeed, in a world, as I described it at the beginning, where we increasingly see overlapping international organizations, the question of kind of comparison in the legitimacy between organizations becomes increasingly relevant. And it is that organizations strive to be more legitimate than their main competitors, because that's what counts for them if they want to remain the main organization in which certain problems are solved. So that comparative dimension is very important. And partnerships with other legitimate entities can indeed be one way by which organizations try to foster their own legitimacy. In fact, I'm involved in a larger research project that looks at the narratives that international organizations use to legitimize themselves. And one of those narratives is recognition by others. We call it external recognition. So they claim to be legitimate because others say that they are legitimate, right? And this is an attempt to affiliate yourself with. There's also a dynamic of differentiation, legitimation by differentiation. So you really try to make clear to a relevant audience how you are different from your main competitor or rival. So I think that comparative dimension is increasingly important to understanding IO legitimacy. Maybe we don't give it enough due in the special section. And then there is one broader question. There was
also one on India that I missed right at the top when I was scrolling through on the conference.
There's one by Federico.
And one by Federico, yeah.
About the role of IOs in today's global order, and whether we think that smaller, more narrow purpose IOs, more agile IOs might be more relevant and kind of easier to use than more general global IOs. I think your intuition is right here. In the sense that the challenge of building a new or an adapted international order is to build one that is multi-level, in the sense that it makes sense to have global IOs with everyone's as members that kind of coordinate among everyone, potentially including among the various regional or smaller organizations that exist within them. But of course, these smaller IOs, regional organizations, for example, have advantages in terms of their homogeneity, their ability to take decisions, their cultural affinity that also makes it easier to act in many cases. But they require coordination amongst themselves. Certain problems, take climate change, can only be solved at the global level. So for that, regional organizations won't be sufficient. You need another layer that is global. And this is where the United Nations really comes in. And it might take an increasingly strong role in coordinating regional efforts among themselves rather than really becoming active by and of itself. I think that's an important point. We also see diversification of the global governance landscape. International organizations are increasingly being rivaled by other types of cooperation, informal organizations, public-private partnerships, that kind of thing. And I think that that differentiation, if you want, some would say it's a form of fragmentation, has some advantages because differentially institutionalized IOs have certain strengths and weaknesses. It might well be that more informal IOs or smaller IOs can counter some of the disadvantages that say more institutionalized global IOs really have. So I think it's about the right mix and the right balance, if you will.
Thank you so much for wrapping up so nicely on that, Tobias. Tobias, Laura, Sarah, Joe, thank you so much for your time today. We could have gone on for so much longer, but we've had a really great taste of the articles, which can be found in the special edition of International Affairs, which a link should be in the chat for those that are interested. The theme of multilateralism, the role of international organizations within that is the theme of the Chatham House London conference later this month. So perhaps we'll see some of you there online or in person. Thank you to the organizers of this session, and thank you to you, our brilliant audience, for joining us, and wishing you a very good day ahead. Thank you.